The girl was already digging when the preacher rode up. His coat flapped in the prairie wind like a black flag, and his voice rose high above the whistling grass. "Miss Lindy, what in God's name are you doing?" Lindy Reese didn't stop. Her shovel hit frozen earth, brittle as bone. The cut was shallow but stubborn. Every swing jarred her arms down to the socket, but she kept going. "I said, what are you digging? That's your floor you're breaking." She paused, just long enough to glance up. Hair clung to her dirt-smudged face in damp strands. She wore no bonnet, no gloves, no apron, just her father's old boots, a pair of patched men's trousers, and a flannel shirt too thin for January. "I'm digging a bed," she said flatly, as if she didn't care whether it made sense or not. The preacher blinked. "A what?" "A warm one, down there." She jabbed her shovel toward the pit in the middle of the cabin floor, maybe 2 feet deep already, though the edges were crumbling with each stroke. Her voice was cracked and hoarse, as if she hadn't drunk water in hours. "Earth's warmer under the frost line. I read it in a book Pa brought back from Kansas City. You wouldn't understand." He stepped down from his saddle and peered into the pit. A crude ladder of nailed sticks leaned awkwardly down. Next to it sat a pile of hay, a roll of quilts, and an iron stovepipe angled strangely into the ground. "I've seen a lot of odd things since taking the Lord's work to these hills," he muttered, "but I ain't never seen a girl build a coffin to sleep in." Lindy turned away. "You can leave, Reverend. I didn't ask for anyone's help. You've got 4 walls, a roof and a stove. You don't need to burrow into the devil's basement. The stove barely burns. The walls leak air through every seam. I've already burned through all the firewood I split in November, and I'm not dying up here like Ma did." That shut him up. For a long moment, only the wind spoke. It rattled through the gaps in the walls like fingers across a washboard. He cleared his throat. "If your father was still alive—" "He ain't." That silence stretched longer than the last. "I'll pray for you," the preacher said finally, climbing back onto his horse. "And if you ever want real shelter, Sister Margaret's got a spare cot down at the mission. I don't want charity, I want heat." With that, she turned her back and shoveled harder than before. The sound of hooves faded down the trail as the sun dropped below the trees. Shadows crawled up the log walls of her cabin, and in that dying light, Lindy climbed down into the hole alone, dragging her quilt, a length of pipe, and a hot brick with her. 3 weeks earlier, the first snow had hit like a boot in the ribs, not a gentle powdering. No one called it pretty. The wind had driven it sideways, tearing branches off trees, pushing smoke back. Down chimneys, burying fence posts overnight. Lindy had watched it from the doorway, arms crossed, stove barely glowing. She'd already run through the last of her good firewood. What remained was damp pine, full of rot and sap. It smoked and hissed like a snake when she fed it in. That night she barely slept. The cold got into her spine and stayed there. By morning her water bucket had frozen solid. She couldn't feel her toes. She sobbed, trying to button her dress, the cloth too stiff to fold. She knew right then, if she didn't figure something out, she'd be dead before February. Everyone else had kin, or husbands, or neighbors close enough to trade help for eggs or bacon. Lindy had none of that. She'd taken the plot up north when no one else wanted it. Scrubland, short pines, half-day's ride from any town. Her father had died before he could finish the roof. Her mother had passed the winter after from the cough. She was 17, and now she was alone, except for the book. It was moldy, warped from moisture, titled Soils and Subterranean Temperatures in Continental Climates. Her father had found it on some back-alley cart in Kansas City, thought it had practical ideas. Lindy had dismissed it at first, but as the cabin got colder, she reread the part that claimed 6 feet beneath the earth. The ground held steady warmth, even in winter. So she decided to test it. No one would have believed her if she asked, and she didn't ask. She took a hatchet to the floorboards, dug a narrow trench with a pickaxe, cut vent holes in the floor above, fed a stovepipe down, made a strange sideways elbow of rusted metal to try and pull the warm air down where she needed it. The neighbors heard the chopping. The Odells passed by on sled and asked if she was fixing her joists. "No," she said plainly. "I'm building a bed down there." They laughed so hard the mule stopped walking. "You'll get buried alive when that cave-in comes," Mr. Odell cackled. "Better warm and buried than frozen and breathing," she muttered, but not loud enough for them to hear. By the time the third snow hit, she'd lined the shallow pit with hay, then clay, then old feed sacks packed with moss. She nailed the feed sacks to the sides with flat rocks inside to hold the heat. Over the top she built a crude trapdoor, an old shelf really, with a quilt nailed on for insulation. She added a stovepipe joint to curve downward at a strange angle, so heat from her dying stove could drift in. The first night she slept in it, she cried again, but for a different reason. She could breathe. She could feel her toes. Her nose didn't drip blood from the cold. She still heard the wind outside, but it no longer pierced through her bones. When she emerged in the morning, frost lined the cabin walls like salt, but down below, it had stayed warm enough to keep her water liquid in a tin cup. Her breath barely steamed. She hadn't slept that deep since summer, By the second week of February, things got worse in the valley. The McClearys downriver lost a child to the freeze. Their boy had gotten up to use the outhouse and never made it back. They found him curled beside the coop, face grey-blue and stiff. Mrs. Hart collapsed, hauling firewood. Her son tried to light the stove for her, but the flue was blocked. The smoke turned the room black, and now she coughed blood daily. The town doctor said the weather was crueler than any in 20 years, that it was unnatural. Men blamed it on the mountain wind, the timber cuts, bad luck, even sin, but no one thought to ask Lindy Reese how she was doing, not until Clyde Ransom knocked at her door. She didn't hear the knock at first. She was down in the pit, half asleep, curled like a cat, under 3 quilts with a brick wrapped in tin at her feet. The knock came again, louder, and finally she crawled up, creaked open the trapdoor, and saw his red face through the cracked door. "Clyde?" she said groggily. "What is it? You warm?" She blinked. "What? Are you warm? Right now?" She stepped aside to let him in. His eyebrows lifted at the frost-lined walls and smokeless stove. "You sick?" he asked. "No." He pointed at the stove. "How's it heating without smoking?" She said nothing. He spotted the odd square hole in the floor. "That where the heat goes?" Still, she said nothing. "My ma's dying of the chill. Our house don't hold it, not even close. Our firewood's gone. The hens froze 2 nights back." He looked her in the eyes. "Miss Lindy, would you show me what you built?" She stared back a long while. Then finally she nodded. Lindy didn't say a word as she led Clyde down the narrow pit. He followed slowly, uncertainly, like a man entering a cave he didn't trust. His boots slid on the rungs of the stick ladder she'd nailed into the dirt wall, and he reached out to steady himself on the hay-packed sides. The moment his head dipped below the floor level, his shoulders slackened. "It's warmer," he murmured. Lindy didn't answer. She knelt beside the stone-lined trench that curved along the back wall, a crude air duct connected by pipe to the stove above. Beside it was a pile of coals she'd raked down earlier, still giving off a faint heat. Above them, the trapdoor hung heavy with quilts. Even with the wind howling outside, no draft reached them down there. "This is where you sleep?" he asked. "I've been here a week and a half," she said simply. He crouched down, then sat fully on the hay-packed dirt floor. "Feels like almost spring down here. My fingers are tingling. I can feel 'em again." "That's 'cause your blood's moving again. First thing that comes back." He rubbed his hands together. "My ma can't take another night. Our place is iced inside. Her cough's getting deeper. I thought maybe you'd have some wood to trade, but..." He looked around slowly, eyes wide with realization. "Lindy, you ain't using more wood. You're using less." She nodded once. "I thought this was just crazy talk, but it's working." She said nothing, only watched him sit there with steam rising faintly off his jacket. His fingers flexed. His eyes weren't as red as when he walked in. He looked up. "I can't carry her far. Her legs won't hold. And Pa, he's gone now." Lindy's voice was quiet. "How far you ride?" 6 miles, up the gulch." She nodded slowly. "Too far to carry her through snow, but close enough to dig." He blinked. "What do you mean? You got a shovel?" "Course I got a shovel, but what?" "Then go home, dig the bed, same as I did. Pickaxe if you got one. You don't need a full hole, just 4 foot deep, 3 across. Line it with sacks. Moss if you've got any, or just hay. Build a wall on the side, like a shelf, and push your stovepipe in toward it. You'll need a bend joint. I got scrap metal, rusted, but I think I can shape it. Then go." "But I don't. How do I know this'll..." "You don't," she said firmly. "But it's that or your ma dies by Friday." He was halfway up the ladder before she called out again. "Clyde." He turned. "Don't tell anyone else yet. Let 'em laugh a little longer." His face cracked into the first real smile he'd had all week. "All right, Lindy. Won't tell a soul." But by Sunday, 3 other families knew. It started when Mrs. Hart's son came knocking, eyes sunken and rimmed red, holding his cap in both hands, like it was the only thing keeping him from falling apart. "My ma's bad," he said. "Mr. Ransom said you helped his." Lindy didn't even let him finish. She handed him her second quilt and pointed at the floor. "Get digging." By the time the first thaw came, just a mild day when the snow stopped falling for once, 8 separate homes had dug bed holes, as the children called them. Some were deeper than others, some just shallow pits with hay and a little cover. A few had tried copying her stovepipe trick. Others just curled up in the warm dirt and huddled. They weren't perfect. One collapsed when a drunk tried to hollow out a full room and passed out halfway. Another had to be emptied when meltwater trickled in through a cracked wall, but all of them were warmer than the cabins above. And then came the visitors. They didn't come with thanks. They came with questions. The sheriff came first. Old Sheriff Nels rode up to Lindy's cabin in the early dark with frost on his beard and his spurs rusted from snow melt. He didn't knock. He just stood at the open door and stared. "Miss Reese," he said, "word's going around that you've been telling folks to sleep underground." She didn't answer right away. Her hands were busy rubbing a rag across her cracked pot, scraping soot off the rim. "You know anything about the McCleary boy getting sick down there in that hole?" Lindy looked up slowly. "McCleary boy got sick 'cause his family had him sleeping by an unclean stove, breathing smoke. He's got a cough now, saying it's mold from the dirt. Could be the mold in their chimney." He stepped closer. "You been taking money for this advice?" She blinked. "What?" "I asked if you were taking money. Some of the families say you're the one told them to dig." "I told them not to die." Nels didn't like that answer. He crossed his arms and looked around the room, sparse, quiet, clean. Too clean for a girl who'd lived through this freeze alone. "You must be hiding something," he said. "A girl alone in a cabin like this. No sickness, no frostbite, no trouble. And now half the neighbors are copying you like you got the word of God on your tongue." She looked up. "You want to see the hole?" He snorted. "What?" "Come look." She opened the trapdoor and pointed at the ladder. "Go ahead." He eyed the dark pit. "I ain't climbing into some dirt tomb." "Then don't question what you don't understand." Nels left in a huff, threatening to report this to the county clerk, though he had no idea what he'd write down. By then, it was too late. Half the valley had heard. The other half was copying. The only one who hadn't said a word about it was the preacher. He hadn't come by since the day he'd watched her shovel through frozen dirt. But one Sunday morning, Lindy opened her door to find a strange note pinned there with a splinter of wood. It read, "To labor in the dust is to remember the dust we are made of. May the Lord bless the low places this season. R.D." That was the closest to an apology she'd ever get, and it was enough. But not everyone was so quiet. Mrs. Tilson, who lived on the ridge with her brother and 2 sisters, refused to believe it worked. "She's tricking folks into sleeping with rats," she told anyone who would listen. "I heard she buried chickens down there just to trap heat from their bodies. That ain't natural." One night, her brother went down to Lindy's place on his own, asked if she could help them dig one for their aunt, who'd taken to coughing blood. Lindy gave him the same advice. He left with an extra roll of sacking. Mrs. Tilson found out 2 days later and burned it all. Their aunt died the following night. Still, Mrs. Tilson told everyone, it wasn't the cold, it was fate, but no one believed her after that. By the time March came, the sun was still faint, but the winds died down enough for the snow to melt slightly each afternoon before refreezing at night. The frost pulled back from the riverbanks. The woods stopped cracking from cold, and Lindy Reese, who had once been called that fool girl in the woods, now had 3 children, knocking every 3rd day to ask if they could sleep in the warm cave. She always said no, unless they brought moss, hay, or clean cloth. "This ain't charity," she said. "It's knowledge. That means you pay by learning." One boy, 10 years old, came back a week later with a tin stove flap he'd repaired by hand. "You still cold?" he asked proudly. Lindy let him sleep there that night. Then came the spring flood, and that changed everything. The rains came down through the pine valleys without warning, slamming over the thawing snow like a hammer through glass. It wasn't a drizzle, wasn't even a storm in the usual way. It was a wash, as if the mountains themselves were leaking. Days earlier, the air had carried a bitter stillness, that false calm where snow lingers under a thin sun but doesn't melt. Then, suddenly, it gave. Warm winds from the lowlands swept up the ravine. Grey clouds collapsed over the high ridge, and then came the deluge. For most settlers, spring meant hope. Meltwater promised running creeks, looser soil for planting, and the slow return of birds. But this thaw hit too fast, too deep. Ice that had hardened over months broke loose from hillsides and came sliding down with mud and rock behind it. Every creek turned foul with debris, and cabins, hastily raised on shallow stones, began to shift under their own weight. One by one, their foundations moaned, and it was Lindy who heard the first scream. She had just finished packing a clay lining tighter around her stove's elbow joint, something she did daily now to keep smoke from leaking backward into the bed pit, when she heard a crack not from within her own walls but far off, like a tree splitting down its middle. Then came the scream, not the animal kind, the human kind, high, breathless, ripped by water. She threw the trapdoor open, scrambled up the ladder, and burst from the cabin without shoes. Her feet hit wet earth that squelched and slid. Water coursed through every rut between the pines. The air stank of moss, rot, and something deeper. Old stone, perhaps, unearthed for the first time in a century. She followed the sound. Down the gulch, not far from the bend where the Ransoms had dug their own basement bed, Lindy spotted the collapse. The ground had fallen inward like a sucked egg, and the roof of their small shed, where Clyde said they'd reinforced the pipe, was gone entirely. In its place was a gaping, water-filled sinkhole. A boy clung to a splintered log at the edge, screaming. Lindy didn't hesitate. She slid down on hands and knees, grabbing at roots and clumps of grass, ignoring how they tore in her grip. When she reached the edge, she saw Clyde's brother, Benji, dangling halfway over the drop. His fingers were white around the log. Mud smeared his chest. One boot was gone, sucked clean off. His eyes were wild. "Don't move," she shouted. "I didn't mean to. I tried to check the pipe. It started sucking me in." "Where's your mama?" "Still inside. I think the roof went. Miss Lindy, I can't hold." The bank gave a lurch. She dropped flat, grabbed the collar of his shirt, and with one brutal heave, yanked him over the lip. He collapsed against her, sobbing and soaked, while behind them the ground kept swallowing the earth in slow, sickening gulps. Clyde was there minutes later, soaked to the ribs, face pale, shovel in one hand. He skidded to a stop beside them. "Ma's out," he gasped. "I got her out the other side, but the hole's done. Gone." Benji reached for him. They embraced in a tangle of wet flannel and tears. The pit had caved in, but the bed, Lindy's trick, had kept them alive through winter long enough to escape when spring turned cruel. That was the first collapse. Others followed. The Tilson shed, the Harper lean-to, the back half of Mr. McGraw's cabin, all lost to the softening ground. And with each failure, each broken wall, each sagging roof, the gossip changed. The whispers shifted. No longer fool girl with a hole in her floor. Now they said, smart girl. Stubborn girl, but smart. Girl who saw it before we did. By the end of March, her cabin was the only one for miles that hadn't buckled, and the irony was that it wasn't even properly built. No stone foundation, no brick chimney, no cross-bracing. But what Lindy had, no one else did: the earth. Her bed wasn't just warm, it was stable. The layers of clay and hay she'd packed along the walls absorbed the shifting water. The pit floor stayed damp but intact. Her fire stayed lit. And the pipe, fed low through the trench, carried heat where it was needed, without smoke. Now they came not to mock her, but to study her. Mrs. Hart's son came with a small notebook and began sketching her trapdoor lid. The preacher returned too, standing silently one morning on her porch, watching the wind puff up steam from her stovepipe like some holy apparition. This time he said nothing, but not everyone came with humility. One afternoon the schoolmaster from downriver rode up on a slick gelding and stepped down like he owned the dirt. He wore a long coat buttoned high and gloves too clean for work. Behind him stood two other men, traders by look with slick hair and shifty eyes. "Miss Reese," the schoolmaster said with a smile too tight to be friendly, "word is you've discovered a method of subterranean retention. Heat preservation is what some call it. I wonder if you'd mind showing my associates your setup. We've an interest in innovative pioneer solutions." She didn't move. "You're not here for warmth," she said slowly. He chuckled. "Well, we're all here to learn from one another. You must know by now that news of your technique has traveled. There's been talk in the county seat." "Talk of what?" "Talk of reward, and maybe patent. If you'd like to demonstrate this bed of yours, we could—" "It ain't for sale." He blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "It ain't yours, ain't the county's, ain't the governor's. It's dirt, and it's common sense. I didn't invent nothing. I remembered what others forgot." One of the traders stepped forward. "You know, miss, some of these ideas might even be illegal. You got open flames below grade. That's a hazard. What if it spreads? What if your hole collapses and children die?" Lindy didn't blink. "Better they die warm than live frozen." The schoolmaster's smile slipped. "You've got quite the mouth for a girl alone." She took a step forward, eyes sharp. "And you've got a lot of teeth for someone who don't plan to eat dirt today." There was a pause. Long, awkward, windless, and then the schoolmaster cleared his throat and backed away. "No need to get defensive," he said. "We'll be on our way." They didn't come back. That spring, as the valley turned green and deer returned to the tree line, Lindy began digging again. But this time, not for herself. Clyde brought her to his aunt's property, where she helped dig a 3-foot heat trench near the hearth and ran pipe through stones. Mrs. Hart offered to trade eggs in exchange for her design, and soon built a bench over a shallow pit where her boy could sleep warm. Even Mrs. Tilson, after all her talk, came walking up one evening near dusk. No bluster, no insults, just a crumpled hat in her hands and a quiet, "Would you come help us dig one?" Lindy said yes, but only after she made the woman apologize to the soil. "I'm sorry, Dirt," Mrs. Tilson said, red in the face. "I should have trusted you." A traveling tinker brought word from the southern valley. 24 families there had dug similar pits, after hearing rumors about a girl who lived beneath her floor. One had carved his directly into a hillside and lined it with flat shale. Another family, short on stovepipe, redirected the heat from their kitchen fire into a side trench dug below their pantry. Some called it earth warming, others called it ground sleep. But every time Lindy heard a new term, she just shook her head and said quietly to herself, "It's still just dirt." By autumn, she couldn't walk through town without someone nodding or offering fresh eggs or dried meat. Some wanted her to speak at the harvest festival, but she declined. "I didn't survive to talk about it, she said once to Clyde. I survived to keep working. Clyde was the only one who didn't change around her. He didn't look at her like a legend. He just brought her supplies sometimes, helped patch her chimney, and never once asked for anything in return. When they dug a second pit near his cabin for his cousin's family, he worked twice as long as anyone else, even as the others joked that Lindy's got him whipped. But Lindy noticed the way Clyde carried his shoulders now, higher, steadier, the way his voice didn't tremble when he asked questions, like the warmth hadn't just reached his skin, but his spine too. But not everything was easy, as the first frost of the new winter touched the fields again, early this time, biting before the leaves could even finish turning. A man arrived from the east. He didn't knock. He showed up at her door, wearing a dark grey coat with brass buttons, holding a satchel and a polished black cane. His boots were stiff with town polish, not scuffed like a settler's. "Miss Reese?" he asked. "Samuel Vaughan, from the Office of Settlement Affairs." She opened the door halfway. "What do you want?" He smiled tightly, though there was no real warmth behind it. "I'm here to discuss a matter of infrastructure and safety. We've received reports that your method of heating, though effective, may pose certain risks if implemented improperly. We're compiling a register of such systems for legal review." She stared at him. "You want to ban it?" she said flatly. No, merely to understand it, and to ensure that its implementation across various homesteads meets the safety guidelines laid out in some office 1,000 miles from here." He shifted, adjusting his coat. "We must think of the long term. Children breathing in mold, risk of cave-ins, carbon monoxide buildup. Do you have formal ventilation, fireproofing?" "I have a stove that burns less wood than anyone's in town," she snapped, "and I haven't lost a toe to frostbite." "You?" He laughed awkwardly. "I stay in a hotel in Kansas City, Miss Reese." "Then you don't know what it's like to burn a log down to ash and still feel your teeth chatter by morning. You don't know what it's like to lie in bed afraid to sleep because you might not wake up. You don't know nothing." His eyes narrowed a little. "I understand that you're passionate, but knowledge must be managed, or it becomes dangerous." She stepped out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. "You came all this way to stop people from digging a warm hole. Did the railroad tell you to do this? Or the timber mill?" "I'm not at liberty to—" "No, you're not," she cut him off. "So walk back to wherever you came from and tell them this. The dirt's older than your laws. It don't bend to brass buttons or folded paper." He hesitated, then gave a short nod. "Well, we'll be watching this closely. You do that," she said, and slammed the door. The next freeze came hard, colder than last year. Earlier, the snow came fast, dry and bitter, lashing sideways across the valley like a blizzard made of dust and shards. Trees bent, the rivers froze solid by the 1st of November, but the cabins this time didn't suffer like before. Most had reese beds now, or some form of them. Pits, trenches, half-cellars repurposed into bunk spaces, even the Tilson. Women had dug a new one, though they disguised it under a rug and swore it was only for root storage. That December, no children died. That January, no mothers coughed blood. People still suffered, still went hungry, still felt the cold bite their skin when hauling water or feeding animals. But they didn't lie awake at night wondering if they'd die before morning. And when spring finally came again, slower this time, gentler, the valley didn't feel broken. It felt ready. One evening, after a long day of cutting ice from the well and hauling it to a neighbor's smokehouse, Lindy sat on the porch with a chipped mug of weak tea and stared out across the pines. Her hands were calloused now in ways they hadn't been before. Her back ached more than it used to, but there was a steadiness to the world that hadn't been there a year ago. Clyde walked up the trail. He held a folded blanket under one arm, and his sleeves were rolled up against the chill. "Built another one," he said, as he sat beside her. "This time for the Grangers. They lost their chimney, but their pit kept 'em warm." She nodded. "Glad they made it." He looked at her. "Do you ever think about what might have happened if you hadn't started digging that day?" She shook her head. "Don't matter now." "But what made you start?" She sipped her tea, thoughtful, then quietly. "I think I was scared, but I knew being scared wouldn't help, so I chose to move, just one thing at a time, one shovel, one layer, and I figured, if I went down far enough, maybe I'd find a place the cold couldn't reach." Clyde looked at her for a long time. "You did," he said, "and now you've given it to everyone else." She didn't answer, just wrapped her hands tighter around the mug. Then he added, "You know, I had a thought." "Oh?" He pulled something from his pocket. It was a small wooden sign, rough but carefully carved. On it the words, "Warmth is where you dig for it. L. Reese." He handed it to her. She didn't speak for a moment. Then quietly, "That's awful sentimental." "Yeah," he said, "but true." She stared at the sign for a long time, then stood, walked over to her trapdoor, and nailed it right into the edge, just above the ladder. That summer, a small article appeared in the back pages of a Kansas City newspaper. Young homesteaders' dirt bed saves dozens in harsh winter. Lindy Reese of Carter's Valley proves ingenuity can come from the coldest places. Officials skeptical, but survivors speak plainly. Her idea worked. There was no photo, just her name. That was enough. But Lindy didn't change. She didn't move to town, didn't ask for reward, didn't try to build a business or seek applause. She spent the next months doing what she'd always done, cutting wood, patching leaks, raising a pair of goats she'd traded for, and helping anyone who asked how to stay warm the way she had. One day, a girl from another valley showed up, barefoot, frostbitten fingers, but eyes bright with stubbornness, and asked, "Are you the woman with the bed?" Lindy said yes. The girl asked, "Can you teach me?" Lindy handed her a shovel, and together they dug. By the third winter, it wasn't Lindy who had to dig anymore. There were already children doing it, 10-year-olds swinging picks under their mother's gaze, boys clearing out root cellars to turn them into sleeping pits, girls lining the walls with clay and old flour sacks the way Lindy had shown them. The Reese bed wasn't something whispered about anymore. It had become its own kind of teaching, passed quietly across valleys like a root system under frost, strong and unseen. Lindy didn't ask for that. She didn't even expect it. But there it was. And this time, as the wind came down from the north, and the sky turned that deep grey-green that meant snow would come hard and long, no one waited to act. They dug before the first flake touched the ground. They stocked moss and hay. They ran stovepipes low, angled like hers, elbowed just so. There were fewer calls of desperation, fewer late-night knocks at her cabin door, which, in its own way, felt lonelier, not sad, not bitter, just quieter. Lindy found herself watching the tree line more that season. She'd sit on her porch with her cracked mug of tea, listening to the soft thrum of wind through pine, hearing distant axes strike in rhythm, not the frantic hacking of emergency, but measured, steady work. She knew that sound. It was the sound of people preparing, not panicking. She hadn't heard it the first year. In mid-January, during a cold snap that had even the creek frozen still as glass, Clyde came by, dragging a sled. On it sat a rolled-up iron pipe, a bent shovel, and a box covered with burlap. "Got a problem," he said plainly. Lindy nodded and stepped off the porch. They walked the slope down to the Harper property, where the bed pit was full of warmth, but smoke had started leaking from the vent hole. "Backflow," Lindy muttered, kneeling beside it. "The elbow's angled wrong. Needs a steeper pitch and a chimney cap." "I told them," Clyde said, "but they didn't believe it could matter. Now they do." They fixed it together, her fingers guiding his, hammering the pipe into place with rocks. When it was done, the smoke lifted cleanly out the top, coiling in a thin grey line against the pale sky. Mrs. Harper stood nearby, arms folded tight. She didn't say thank you, but the next day, she sent over a jar of gooseberry preserves. Lindy smiled when she saw it. She never did like words much. February brought ice storms. Trees snapped under the weight of it. Roads vanished beneath white sheets so smooth they looked like polished stone. But inside the cabins, people slept, not like the first year, huddled and wide-eyed, listening for the creak of failing wood or the wind slipping under door cracks. This year, they slept deep, because this year they were ready, at least most of them. The knock came late, not as late as that first scream she'd once followed, but close. The wind had already turned violent outside, clawing at the corners of her cabin, slipping needles of frost through every knot in the wood. She was already in her pit, wrapped in her quilts, one warm brick tucked beneath her feet, when she heard the thump above. She waited, just a moment. Another knock, then a voice, thin as a reed. "Miss Lindy, please, we didn't know who else." She climbed up, opened the trapdoor, and was hit by a blast of bitter air. A man stood at her door, hat gone, fingers blue at the edges, and beside him, barely standing, a young woman, in her arms, a bundled infant. "We tried," he stammered. "We dug, but the sides kept falling in. The heat never caught. The baby, he won't cry anymore." Lindy didn't speak. She didn't ask names. She simply stepped aside. "Get in," she said. They staggered past her, collapsing near the stove. She took the baby first, unwrapping the cloth, touching its chest, still warm, breathing shallow but steady. "You were lucky," she said, almost to herself. The young woman broke down then, sobbing into her own arms. Lindy stoked the stove, lit another brick to warm, passed it under the blankets. She gave them her second quilt, her best mug of broth, and led them one by one into the bed pit below. She sat beside them as they fell asleep, mother, father, child, curled on the warm, packed hay. It was tight, cramped, not meant for four, but no one complained. No one asked for space because it was warm. The next morning, after the storm passed and the trees stood still again, in their brittle silence. The man offered Lindy a bundle of coins wrapped in his scarf. She looked at it for a long second, then pushed it back into his hands. "Build it again," she said, "but this time, do it right." He nodded once, eyes wet. "I'll build it deep and low and warm." She saw them off, standing on her porch as they vanished back into the trees. Word traveled again after that, not just of Reese beds, but of the cabin where you could knock, of the woman who would open her trapdoor to strangers, of the girl who wasn't clever but simply brave enough to dig and stay. Years passed. Some winters were mild, some weren't. But every time frost crept over the valley, settlers remembered Lindy's trick, and every time another young woman stepped onto that land to start her own homestead, someone, an elder, a teacher, a neighbor, would tell her about the girl who dug for warmth. And every one of them, when they started their cabin, made sure to build down before they ever built up. Lindy aged, her hands grew stiffer, her eyes dimmed some, but her cabin never changed. She still kept the old trapdoor, still slept beneath the floor when the frost came in sharp. She never replaced it with something fancier, never carved stairs, never covered the hole, because she didn't want to forget. The low place had saved her. She owed it everything. And when people asked, sometimes, if she ever felt shame for once being mocked, for once being the girl alone in the dirt, she would just smile her tired smile and answer, "They laughed when I built a basement bed, but I slept 36 degrees warmer." And that was the end of it. Decades later, when Lindy was long gone and her cabin left empty for the last time, a storm rolled through harder than any since the first, snow up to the eaves, trees stripped, roads vanished, but her cabin stood. And when the sheriff, 2 generations removed from Nell's, rode out to check on it, he opened the creaking door and found no fire, no light, just one thing left behind, a nailed sign, still visible, though the wood had weathered and the paint had faded. It read, "Warmth is where you dig for it, El Reese." He touched the edge with gloved fingers.